it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Zed, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel. Broadcasting live from Studio Zed.
makes me act the way I do.
Welcome to The Other Side. I'm Athena Actipus.
And I'm Dave Lundberg Kenrick. How's it going?
It's good. Dave, do you have friends on the other side?
Apparently, yeah, I do. I think all my friends are on the other side. How about you?
I've got friends on both sides, I think. So.
Oh, nice.
So this is our first show of The Other Side, and I am so excited. We've got a whole new concept here for a show, which is about really having a conversation with people who disagree about really important and controversial current topics. So really, what is more controversial or current than the current debates around how we should or shouldn't be protecting ourselves from COVID, mask wearing, social distancing, etc.
Yeah, I do. I actually, as I was biking up here today, I noticed that a lot of people seem to have stopped, and I don't know if that's the weather or if we're just like, are we still doing this? So,
yeah, well, and it's interesting, right? Because simultaneously, people are getting really fatigued, right, from this sort of long time that we've been dealing with COVID, and we're having a spike, which is worse than it's ever been. So we're in a situation where, in a way, a lot of people are being less careful, but in terms of the risk, it's higher than it has ever been. So it's a tough spot that we're in right now.
Yeah, but it's like less interesting, sort of. It's less novel, or it's like, oh gosh, yeah, I know, I could die, but it just, I don't know. I got other stuff. I'm worried about that.
Mortality risk gets old after a while, right?
Yeah, you're like, yeah. So, but no, it's an interesting challenge because, like, one of the guests we're going to have on today is my dad, who is really worried about it. He's older than me. He's old enough to be my dad. And when I see him,
he's not just old enough to be your dad. He is your dad.
That's right. But whenever I'm around my parents, there's this sort of thing where I'm worried about them. But I also do know that I have, since probably over the past couple of months, I've started backsliding in terms of social distancing, and in terms of mask wearing and things like that. And so I think it's hard. It's really hard to keep up.
Yeah.
And so
I'm kind of on the other side, Dave. So, I am super careful. I have been ever since the beginning because, when I was a kid and then, all through my life, I've been really susceptible to respiratory infections. And for me, it's just not worth it. So, I have been and essentially just am still on complete lockdown and have been since March. So, I order my groceries in. I'll go for walks without my mask on, but I've always got it in my pocket in case I'm getting close enough to people. And I don't see people socially except on Zoom.
Interesting.
So.
I wonder, so for me, I've always had asthma as a kid. I was in the hospital for it once, but most of the time I've thought of it as a minor inconvenience. And I think a lot of times in my head, I picture getting COVID as just sort of like 3 days of asthma, which is probably not an accurate image of it.
Yeah, E. Lee has this great comment that, viruses don't care about the psychological fatigue. And from COVID's perspective, right, from COVID's evolutionary perspective, it's like, fuck yeah, you guys are all going inside and now you're going to, party over the holidays. So, it's, COVID doesn't care if we're sick of it. It's still going to make us sick.
Yeah. So, I mean, but I don't know. Now I'm at the point where I'm like, well, maybe we just live side by side in harmony with COVID. And so
I don't think it's going to be harmony, though. That's the thing. So Dave, why don't we bring on our first guest? We have Diana Fleischman joining us. Diana, thank you so much for being with us here on our premiere of The Other Side. I think your mic is on mute, by the way.
I'm Diana Fleischman, and I am an evolutionary psychologist, but I studied disgust and responses to disease a lot when it's my PhD on that. And then my first postdoc was with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which was about hand washing and how to get people around the world to hand wash. And given the huge proportion of children under 5 around the world that die from diarrheal diseases, it's really amazing that humans don't have a very good ability to understand germ theory. And you can go on about germ theory. This is what we learned about India with the people that I was working with, Val Curtis and Bob Unger. You could tell people about germ theory, but it's not going to really improve their ability to wash their hands, for example, even though the lives of their children are at stake. So that's really made me more cynical about human responses to disease and how really responsible people can be when they're faced with this very abstract idea about viruses and bacteria and what they might be able to do to you. And just anecdotally, the people that I've seen around not wearing masks and being the most risk taking have actually been the people who are highest risk, have been the oldest people that I've seen. So it doesn't seem like it's tracking very well necessarily people's individual risk, like people with pre-existing conditions. But I myself, I live in a state, New Mexico, that has one of the harshest lockdowns in this country. And people are very strict. And it's also become a very strong point of signaling, which you can say is good and bad in our country right now.
Thanks, Diana.
You mean sort of like political signaling?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you see here in New Mexico, which is very, very democratic, you see people wearing masks in their cars. You see them wearing masks when they walk their dogs. And there's a mask mandate here. And so people are very much more I think they do signal much more here with mask wearing, especially if you're in your car wearing a mask.
Yeah, I think for me, I think I wore it as signaling. And now that the election's over, I'm like, oh, we're still doing this? Like, it's like Halloween's over, let's take the masks off. Like, I really think that. So now I'm sort of coming to terms with this idea of how much was I just going along with this is what we're doing? And how much am I really worried about this?
Yeah.
So now it seems like we have a lot of comments that make it seem like people are pretty darn worried. So like here we've got Elise says she has terrible garbage lungs, doesn't want to introduce a horde of trash rats into that's a pretty good image. That's a much grosser image. So Diana, like in terms of disease avoidance, since COVID is a disease that doesn't have a lot of sort of gross features, how do you think that affects?
Well, and let me just jump in on this too, right? Because it's not just that like COVID is not like, it doesn't make you look like a zombie. People are often asymptomatic, so you don't even know that they're carriers. And and Dave, like, I get it that you're, fatigued by the whole thing, but I personally disagree. I think it's like, we just gotta do what we gotta do to protect not just ourselves and our loved ones, but our whole like healthcare system is like breaking now because there's so many cases. So I think there's like a lot of other things that we have to consider. So I just had to say that.
Yeah, I think that's something that people, when they talk about health advice, they're telling everybody to wear masks all the time. Of course, you see people wearing masks under their noses. There was a South Park episode where people were making fun of masking, and they were saying it's a chin diaper, like because so many people wearing the mask on their chin, and that's really not how to wear a mask at all. So people improperly wearing masks, I actually have no idea how much of a impact that has, because there are people, like there was a hairdresser who had COVID who saw many clients, I think dozens, and didn't transmit it to anybody. So it does seem like it works. But you also have to think about the kind of health advice that people give people with certain diseases or with pregnant women. What is the advice you're going to give everybody versus what is the advice that you're going to give specific people who are numeracy literate or who understand more about disease transmission? And it's very tricky because if I have some idea about the vulnerability of different people, then I can mitigate my risk in various different ways. But not everybody thinks that way, and it might not be safe to hear that. So there were things that you could have done to reduce the fatigue, but it's now seeming, if everything's on lockdown, of course people are going to be super tired. And in places like Scandinavia, they've made it such that you have to quarantine for a week instead of 2 weeks. They're trying to mitigate that fatigue. And you could say, I don't care about fatigue, but it's a widespread phenomenon right now that's causing a lot of people to not comply with these guidelines.
Yeah. Diana, we have a comment here from E. Lee. She saying, that they hope, right, that like you don't have to know somebody who's been harmed or died from COVID to humanize the impacts of the virus. But, what does the research say on this? Like, is it, do you have to really see somebody who has suffered in order for it to like kind of really hit you that it's a problem that you should be taking more seriously?
I don't know for sure. I know that our psychology of disease has a lot to do. And Dave made a very good point there. He was talking about how it's not a gross disease. So when people have the worst impacts of the disease, people who've been intubated or who have died of serious respiratory failure, those people, you're not seeing them wandering around. And so I remember when there was Ebola in Africa and it was getting transmitted around, people were really, really freaked out because the disease is so much more viscerally disgusting than with COVID. So I think that would have potentially combated the fatigue. But as far as like not being humanized, I mean, our idea about risk, we have an abstract idea about risk, and then we have a more personal idea about risk. If you yourself eat something bad and then you may never eat it again, like if you eat a bad oyster or you get really sick after drinking too much Southern Comfort, as my friend who could never drink Southern Comfort again. But you could also see somebody get really sick after drinking Southern Comfort or see somebody get sick after eating an oyster. And that is how our psychology of risk, I think, more naturalistically manifests. It's very hard to humanize this virus. And something that I've noticed is like in places like China and Taiwan, they've had like public services for people who've died of COVID and like a moment to remember them, even though it's a lower number than here. Whereas here, it seems like I haven't seen like a memorial service for like all the people who've died of COVID. At 9/11, you saw people's names on screens all over the place, all the names of the victims. You haven't seen the names of victims of COVID. So there seems to be a very different manifestation going on here about this disease.
Yeah.
Thanks, Diana. Yeah.
I also think, I was going to say, I think the Southern Comfort thing, it brings up this interesting sort of opportunity cost, right? Like, because if you're like, so not necessarily with masks, but with social distancing in general, which is the other thing I have trouble with, not having people over, not having people, not going out to dinner with people. And it's like, if you're doing that, like, how do we weigh the pros and cons of protecting ourselves from this disease and still living our life?
My dad's not very careful at all. And so when I go home to visit my family, I will have been quarantined for like some period of time. So my mother will see me right away, but my father, after I see him, she will not let me into her house. So I have to mitigate my risk because they're very different in terms of their risk assessment. But I do think that like, this is the difficulty with making a blanket statement. I think that if you don't know anybody personally who has COVID, or you don't know anyone who knows anyone who has COVID, it's like 2 degrees of separation, you're probably fine to spend time in small groups with people that you know, indoors or outdoors. I think that's probably safe. It's the same as any other communicable disease. But this is the thing, you'd have to be talking to people all the time. Do you know anybody with COVID? Have you seen anybody with COVID? You'd have to have these uncomfortable conversations. And I think in some sense, people are more happy to not have these kinds of conversations and do these kinds of risk-taking behavior. But yeah, if you're in a community that has a high rate of COVID, you're very unlikely to get it going to the grocery store. You could get it if you're sitting inside of a restaurant. But if you're interpersonally hanging out with people, my view, that's a little bit controversial, is that's pretty safe as long as there's no degree of separation or 2 degrees of separation with somebody who actually has COVID.
Kaleo is bringing up an interesting point, though, that there's stigma associated with COVID and that people often don't want to admit to having it. So that can potentially make it hard to really know, right, how many of your contacts have it.
Absolutely.
So I want to bring in our next guest now. We're really lucky to have Keith Tidball joining us. Keith, welcome to our premiere episode of The Other Side. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience with COVID and sort of where you stand on these issues?
Well, thanks, Athena, and thank all of you. I work at Cornell University in the Department of Natural Resources, where I'm a social scientist, basically an applied anthropologist. I work on how outdoor recreation and exposure to nature helps people who have or are currently experiencing trauma. And I've worked a lot with disaster survivors, disaster context more broadly, also combat wounded veterans and so forth. And I also am a member of the New York Guard, and about March last year was deployed for our COVID response here in the state of New York as a part of the military forces of this state. And I was deployed for about 3 months, just a little over 3 months. And while I was deployed, early on in that deployment, I actually contracted the disease. I can tell you that I was not asymptomatic. I was highly symptomatic and was really uncomfortable for about a week. In fact, I wasn't sure I was going to recover from it. In terms of that grossness comment that somebody made, I felt pretty gross. Honestly, I felt like there was things in my lungs that I could not explain. And when I coughed or attempted to get productive coughs, it was pretty much futile, and I just kept feeling more and more that I was sinking into something where I just could not breathe. But finally, I turned the corner on that, thankfully, and was able to rejoin my unit a couple weeks later after about 3 weeks of absolute quarantine, but isolated confinement, basically, which was also not fun. And I think that the isolation and sort of the confinement that is part and parcel to this thing broadly is one of the things that we don't talk enough about, but probably need to, because people who have, in the case of where I focus and where I work, people who have experienced trauma or have PTS or other sorts of related illnesses, the last thing in the world they need is, severe isolation and to be cut off from other members of society or the rest of the natural environment. So there's all of that, and I will also say that it's interesting in the world that I work with. I spend a lot of time in outdoor recreation, especially hunting and fishing communities, by virtue of the work that I do, and also with people who are either veterans or currently serving. And there are interesting and diverse opinions, but one of the things that I find jars people into a more sober contemplation of COVID is when I share with them that, hey, I was in the J5. Which is plans for General Natali's group, who was responsible for our state and federal response to COVID back in the spring. And at the end of the day, when we closed down the dual status command, which was the period of time when we had federal assets, we had taken care of 13,000 deceased people and made arrangements in the midst of a broken healthcare system and a broken death system for their bodies to be at least with some dignity, as much as was possible in a pandemic, to be handled in a way that was safe for the rest of the community. And so it's interesting when I hear some of the conversation about this. I am not a person that is risk averse. I grew up as an infantryman, both as an enlisted man and as an officer, and we're predisposed to wear protective equipment. If we want to maintain our hearing, we wear ear protection when we shoot. If we want to maintain our vision, we wear eye pro. If we want to maintain our ability to survive cold water, we wear a life jacket. So it's kind of perplexing to me that this sort of common sense thing like wear a mask, which is not only protective potentially to me, but more importantly to those around me, would be questioned, especially by those that are part of the communities that I work in. It's baffling to me, but this whole thing is baffling.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Do people sort of cheat in terms of the personal protective gear when you see? Because I know, like, I've seen sometimes when people are sort of with bike helmets and other safety gear, there is a certain amount of cheating. Like, and I've noticed sometimes when I'm working on if I'm weed whacking the lawn, say, and I know I should have safety goggles on, and I just a lot of times don't, and so I do, and I don't know if it's just me, but I do feel like in general there is a fair bit of personal protective gear cheating going. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Is that something you've?
Yes. Shame on you, Dave. You should wear your protective equipment. There is a significant amount of that, but in the military context, we have a rucksack full of stories to tell people who are tempted to or actually are cheating in terms of protective equipment about what happens when you cheat. and you can't take it back when some projectile hits you in the eye, or when something loud that you weren't expecting damages permanently your hearing, etc. So, there is cheating in the military context, which I think is instructive more broadly for this conversation. There is peer pressure and other sorts of social pressures that make it impossible to be a cheater. You will experience the duress of your superior braiding you for being out of compliance with that, because nobody wants you to be combat ineffective or what have you. So despite the cheating that may happen, I think that the lesson here, the instructive point, is that our social circles, even small groups, need to adopt that sort of peer accountability, like we do with our non-commissioned officers and officers, to make sure that everybody around us maintains their ability to be effective in society. And that goes to the larger question, Dave, of what are we actually trying to protect, and who are we trying to protect, and what are we trying to prevent on the other side of that coin? And I really honestly believe if people took the time to think about that, and less about this sort of tailgate approach of who's on the blue team and who's on the red team, it would make a lot more sense to do what we need to do, and to be less about risk and more about, what your duty is, as far as, it's not about me, it's about the guy or the gal to my left and my right.
So one thing I've noticed when I talk to people, so not everybody necessarily cheats with the mask thing, but I've talked to a lot of people who have, like, I was talking to somebody the other day who she was saying, she sends her kids to school, right? And she works, she's a single mom, and I could tell she felt really bad about that, and she was like, yeah, well, I would try to have them stay home, but I've got to go to work. And I feel like there's so many different sort of things that we need to try to do in terms of social distancing right now, like on top of mask wearing. It's like, have your kids do online schooling, which I know my daughter hates. It's try to work from home, which not everybody can do. And so I feel like in some sense the social norms are hard to enforce, because not everyone can follow. And I'm not saying they're bad, or even that I condone cheating on these social norms, but I'm just I see a lot of people who are sort of having to cheat, you know what I mean, to get through their life. And so what can we do to sort of balance that?
I think that's a really important observation and question. I don't know that there's not a simple answer. I'd be interested to hear what some of my colleagues have to say about that one. But and again, I hate to sort of, like, back when I was in the military kind of thing on this, but I think there's a lot of instructive principles there. And one of them is, when there's a sort of attack, let's say, or a large engagement of an opposing force, we have to calculate what is the collateral and actual damage to the surroundings, to our own troop strength, and so forth. That's part of what planning and operations looks like. And I think in the case of how we operate in the society, the narrative did change notably. It went from, flatten the curve and make sure that we don't break our healthcare system or break our death system, to, be very afraid in some cases, and I think that somewhere in there, what the most important thing we can do, related to your question, Dave, is to be empathetic. Talk to people who don't see it the way we do. Share the kind of conversations we're having right now about looking at both sides of this. If you're, what's more important for you to prevent right now? The inability of my 6-year-old to have social engagement because of COVID, or to prevent them from having long-term, issues about having been confined in their house for 2 years. And those are real trade-offs that people have to think about, which we should encourage, and we should do that with science, not with political bludgeoning about, blue team, red team. And I think that I can't make that decision for the woman or man that you just described, Dave, but I would have the conversation we're having right now with them, and not make them feel guilty, just make them think.
That's some great advice, Keith. I think, this issue of, like, finding that space where you can have a conversation, listen, understand where the other side is coming from, and, also see, where you don't agree, and be able to have respect around the issues that you don't agree, without it, becoming this politicized issue, whose side are you on? And I think that that's real value in, just listening and trying to understand.
I think there's a lot of people in the comments who are talking about, I think what Keith is saying about trade-offs is really important. And I think that we have a lot of difficulty understanding trade-offs, especially the way that politics is presented in this country. Politicians and policymakers never want to act like there's a trade-off between one set of priorities and another set of priorities. That is, I think, more of a complicated message than people want to send out. But there's a lot of people in the comments who are saying, don't people feel, that they'll be ashamed or that they'll have regret if they do something like they spread COVID to somebody? And there's a study, this was back a few years ago, and they asked people, how guilty would you feel if you transmitted a flu to somebody that killed them? Or how much should somebody be punished if they transmitted a flu to somebody that killed them? Versus how much should somebody be punished and how guilty should they feel if they gave somebody chlamydia? Right. And so I think guilt and shame are really 4 domains of behavior that we already have moralized. It's pretty difficult to moralize going out and seeing your friends. It's very easy to moralize sex. And people thought that the person was less guilty if they gave somebody a flu that killed them than if they gave somebody chlamydia, right? Because of the behavior that it involves. So we can say it's important to talk about shame, how guilty you'll feel if you give somebody COVID, but I don't think it's working very well at all, that kind of messaging. And we can kind of double down on that as much as you want. And unfortunately, expertise has been, become this blue team, red team thing. And if the experts are telling you, you can see nobody at all versus giving you maybe a different kind of message, people are just ignoring that advice completely, as opposed to taking it piecemeal.
Well, should we bring on our next guest?
Yeah, actually, why don't we bring on Jonny Anomaly next to give us another perspective on this? Jonny, do you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about where you come from these issues from in terms of your academic background, but also your approach to how you're living your life during the pandemic?
Sure. I think there's been a big mistake here, which is I'm a professor of PPE, but it's the wrong kind. It's philosophy, politics, and economics, not personal protective equipment. So maybe I should get off the stream now. No, I'm going to add a little perspective on the E side of PPE, which is economics. You guys have mentioned opportunity costs, and that's really important. You've mostly talked about it in terms of individual opportunity cost and mask wearing. What I want to emphasize, well, first, let me just say, I think, sure, you should wear masks, especially around vulnerable people. You should social distance. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. So, do things. If you're going to do them in a gathering, do it outside, et cetera. That's all common sense. But the social opportunity cost is really important, specifically to lockdowns. Masks are trivial. Lockdowns are not. And what I have in mind are a few things. So I think we can divide it up into a few different categories. The social opportunity cost for current people of lockdowns, future people, and then people outside of our country versus inside. So if we talk about the opportunity cost for people who are alive now outside of our country, specifically poor people around the world, the cost of food is going to go up. And if the cost of food goes up, let's say 50%, I don't know what the number is, but tens of millions of extra people will die, which wouldn't have otherwise died. Tens of millions of other people will be malnourished who wouldn't otherwise be malnourished. That's just current people outside of our borders. People inside our borders, even poor people, are rich by international standards. And then when we think about discounting and discount rates, for every bit of economic productivity that we give up, it doesn't just harm us, it also harms future people because of compound interest. So when you think about economic activity, it's not just the manufacture of toys and cars and things, it's also vaccines and basic science research and so on, which builds upon itself and which disproportionately benefits future people. So when we forego economic growth, we're actually damaging future people by a compounded rate. And we have to take that into account. And let's see here. Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah. Thanks, Jonny.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing on that?
You bet. Yeah.
So there's one other kind of transfer that's going on, not just between one country and another or one generation and another, which doesn't yet exist. There's also intergenerational transfers between groups of people who currently exist within a country. And what I have in mind here is when we think about the median age of death of COVID, it's 82 in Europe and 78 here. And that means that half of the deaths are above that, half below. But moreover, when you think about who disproportionately suffers, it is mostly older people. It's true that Some of the people here could suffer because of, lung issues and things, but we have to think about quality adjusted life years. And so when we think about quality adjusted life years, well, if we ruin, let's say, 1 year of a 20-year-old's life versus 1 year of an 80-year-old's life, most of us would think that the year of the 20-year-old's life matters more. And that sounds crass, but that's actually how all of healthcare works. That's why we think like we should really try hard to like spend a lot on vaccines and things targeting young people and maybe care a little bit less about the last few months of older people's lives. And so there's a kind of intergenerational transfer of welfare and of resources in general from young to old here. And I think even if that might be worth it, we need to really explicitly just, sort of admit that and say, okay, that's what we're doing. We're transferring resources from young to old, but it's worth it, let's say.
Thanks, Jonny.
I mean, I also do think, though, those social opportunities for like people in college, right? That college is a big time for people to meet whoever they're going to end up with. And so, like, and also it's a big time for networking in terms of friendships and building careers, right? So those costs for young people are immense, and I think it's really tough for, I back up to a frat house and they're having parties every week, and I kind of am like, well, I get it, this is what they're here for. And it's hard. It's really hard for people to just be like, I'm going to pass up 1 year of college, so that my grandparents have another year. So I don't know.
I think that, you should just, I've heard a lot of people say this, a lot of kind of lockdown skeptics say we should just have a stratified kind of system such that, frat parties, people under 30, they can party, they can spend time with each other as much as they want. The message that we should give them is that they can't interact with vulnerable people. And what was the harm if all of those people got COVID? They might be down with a sickness for a couple weeks, 3 weeks. The major cost would be that they give it to somebody vulnerable. But given that a lot of people are saying, we can really double down on shame and guilt, I think it's a very difficult thing to say because it doesn't seem to be working. And, Joe just said you can avoid lockdowns if everybody's diligent about wearing their mask. Well, we know that people aren't diligent about wearing their masks. And we know that in places like in East Asia, what did they have to do to get people to stay in their homes? They had to threaten them sometimes with being involuntarily hospital quarantined. They put tape on their doors. In some places, they give you a code where you could only leave your house once every 3 days to get some groceries. In Australia, there's a guy who was supposed to be on lockdown and he got out. They're not even like really doing contact tracing because I think that defies some of our ideas in the West about personal freedom. And so you can give people these, these messages all you want. It doesn't seem to be having a huge impact on behavior, especially now that the Christmas and holiday season is coming up. And what people were saying about people being embarrassed about having COVID, if you look at in the West versus in the East, people wear masks all the time in the East, but also there's much less of a market for like cold medicine. People here, they want to take medicine to look like they're not sick. They take cold medicine and they don't want to wear a mask because they don't want to look like they're contagious to other people. And so there's really a very big difference. And even in countries like that, where people are not ashamed of being sick and there was already a big mask wearing population, they had to engage in very strict measures to get people to comply with public health orders.
There's a really interesting dichotomy here now that I'd like to comment on. I appreciate both of those perspectives, and I think that there is something instructive perhaps from the way our Western military culture actually operates. On one hand, it's true that, as Jonny was describing, there are calculations that have to be made, and that there are actually value calculations that are made depending on what people's military occupational specialty is, their rank, their age, et cetera, et cetera. And I 100% understand the empirics around what Jonny's describing. On the other hand, what we were just hearing now describes this sort of other sort of psychology of the personal protective equipment and the wear of it. And one of the things that I think that the U.S. military, especially the Army, but certainly across other branches, is very successful in doing is threading that needle. And I think Joe, in one of the comments, mentioned that phrase. And the way they do it is not only are there smart people somewhere thinking about the sort of economic trade-offs and what the real calculations are without any emotions involved at all, there's at the same time a very explicit socialization of the idea that you as a infantryman or as a special forces Green Beret or whatever are never going to have to worry about the person to your left or your right making sure that you don't get left on the battlefield, whether injured or even killed. So there's a social notion of that my friends, my colleagues, my brothers or sisters in arms have my back no matter what, and will take care of me just like I will take care of them. That's part and parcel of this psychology of protective equipment wear in the military that I think we've got to somehow figure out how to extrapolate that into sort of civilian society, so that while smart people are making those larger calculations about who should be out and who should be quarantined, while that's happening, there's at the same time more camaraderie, more empathy, more sort of sense of family and brotherhood or sisterhood that we have in the military amongst society, so that we actually don't think of this as some sort of a threat or as some sort of an identity hijack, but instead we're thinking about it as taking care of the person to our left and our right.
Yeah, we have a bunch of comments actually about this issue of, how do we kind of get ourselves into a mindset where we are thinking about the person to our left and our right, or, those in our communities. And I mean, to me, one of the really complicated issues here is that there are sort of two levels at which we have to think about managing risk. There's like each of us as individuals, where do we stand in terms of what risks we are willing to take? And, at the table here, we have a lot of diversity in that, right? Some of us are much more, willing to do things that might expose us to COVID, and others like me, are not willing to. But then there's another level, which is, as a society, how much risk are we willing to take, or how much risk can we even bear as a society? And, I'm watching now as hospitals around the country are getting full and overwhelmed and not having even beds nearby to transfer patients to. And that's when I start worrying about, not just our individual preferences about what risk we're willing to take, but the viability of the systems that we've put in place to protect people who are vulnerable, and also, deal with a catastrophe like the current catastrophe. So, when one's individual risk-taking behavior sort of aggregates up to change what's happening on a societal level, it feels like then there's a whole other level of, considerations that have to come into play so that we don't kind of, break our social support systems that we've put in place, whether they're, hospitals and nursing homes. I mean, if you even look at doctors are retiring early and quitting because they're too stressed and they don't have enough PPE, that kind of crisis that we may be facing, I think is, it's something that we have to think about. What are the collective effects of our decision-making behavior here too?
I don't think we know enough about who's transmitting COVID to vulnerable people. So there's been a big conversation throughout this whole COVID dilemma, this disaster, about who is masking, who isn't masking, who is engaging in risk-taking behavior, why some communities have much higher COVID rates than others. So shutting down the Hasidim in New York, they like to congregate together. And so in some cases, it seems like groups are being blamed personally on their behavior. In other groups, they're saying, okay, it's the system. I heard one public health expert say that the reason that the Navajo Nation here in New Mexico has such high rates of COVID is because they have to drive a long way to go to the grocery store, which doesn't make any sense at all. I think that they also have different risk-taking behavior compared to some other groups necessarily. And so it might seem like, okay, the hospitals are becoming overwhelmed. There are doctors who are retiring early. I'm going to do everything that I can to prevent any spread. But honestly, I work from home. I go to the grocery store. I don't go to restaurants. I can't really do any more than I'm doing right now to try and prevent community spread. And being more careful might seem like a thing that you can do, but really, I think the best thing that we could do would become to get public health messaging that actually appeals to the people who are engaging in the most risky behavior. And because we don't do contract tracing, we don't know, what's the socioeconomic status like of people who are spreading COVID a great deal? What's happening? What kind of groups is it? For example, in the Navajo Nation here in New Mexico, there was a huge seeding event because they went to a televangelist revival in Arizona, and a bunch of people got it that way. So you could shame and blame people as much as you want, but I think that until we get down to some kind of widely applied, easily digested message for people that's not don't have Thanksgiving and don't have Christmas. It's just going to be public health officials talking to nobody, especially now that expertise has been downgraded so much over the course of this entire pandemic.
I 100% agree with Diana's what she's saying there, and I also think she raises another issue that's important to keep our eye on, and that is the right now we're not talking about the comorbidities that sort of indicate the additional risk that folks are going to have, and in some of these populations those comorbidities are significantly higher. I wouldn't say I know that for sure about the Navajo Nation, but I would suspect it given other work that I've done with Native communities. And I think that conversation has also been muted by this sort of tailgate red versus blue team thing that's been going on lately. And that's another one of those areas where, we could, if we were being smart about this and we had a good plan and a good playbook, we could be targeting where there are pockets of higher prevalence of comorbidities and protect those folks, just like we would protect important assets in a more military context, and then release others in other areas to be less concerned with that. But we're not doing that. And again, I think that those points are great. That it's about messaging and signaling right now, and there's not enough momentum right now. And maybe this is a political moment, but there's not enough momentum right now to actually change the narrative and change the discourse in such a way that it's about care and about empathy rather than about asserting an opinion.
I disagree strongly. So can I chime in here? I want to tie into two issues that have been raised by, let's see here, first by Diana, but also by Keith and Dave, and that is institutions and expertise. So it's clear that in cases like this, just like in vaccination cases, promoting vaccination or preventing the overconsumption of antibiotics, things like this, these are all massive collective action problems, right? Where we internalize the benefits of bad behavior, but we externalize the costs. And so what we need are institutional solutions, right? Wear a mask, various rules that require us or incentivize to do things. The problem is institutional responses only work when we have reason to trust experts. But when experts politicize what they're up to, as they've done over the last 6 months, declaring racism or capitalism a public health crisis, which they did, right? Just 6 months ago, public health so-called experts declared those two things. I mean, that actually makes it political. So then you wonder, why does the red team doubt every time the blue team says something? Well, that's why, right? Both teams actually politicize different aspects of science. And so to have viable institutional responses, we have to stop politicizing science, and that goes for both sides.
I also want to say, like, even within the context of this conversation, we're talking about it like the red team is the ones not wearing masks and the blue team is. And I'm a person who is on the blue team, but I still cheat on that mask thing a lot, and I know a lot of other people like that who do. And so I do think it's unfair to sort of completely describe it as, I think that across the board, I think there's a lot of people who are doubting, even if they're saying they trust the science and they trust the mask things, there's a lot of people who then they go out and they do whatever they do. So also I thought maybe I should bring on our last guest.
Yeah, let's definitely bring on our last guest. Doug Kenrick, welcome to the show. I know you do a lot of work on, understanding human behavior also, and risk-taking and trade-offs. And we'd love to hear your perspective on this whole issue and, where you stand.
Okay, great. Yeah. So as you're saying, Athena, I'm an evolutionary social psychologist, and I study the effects of activating fundamental motives like the fear of the outgroup or the fear of diseases or mating opportunities, how that affects the way we think, what we pay attention to, how we encode that information. And probably I'm thinking along the most relevant thing is that an article we had in Scientific American, which was just out on the newsstands on a special issue called Truth and Lies, where we talked about the science of anti-scientific thinking. It's really not that easy to think clearly about complex issues. And so we talk in the article about 3 different kinds of obstacles. One of them is just attention. There's so much information coming in out there, like as an evolutionary person, it's really hard to get people to understand all of the evidence about evolution. And so people use simple heuristics. What do the experts say? Or what does someone who I trust say? And I think one of the things, Jonny just brought up this issue of politicization, if I'm saying that word correctly, but politicizing is one of the things that I find kind of troubling is that when we have people like this guy Fauci, who I think no one really knew whether he was Democrat or Republican, and I still don't know, but basically when you start to try to undermine the authority of someone who is actually an expert, that's very dangerous, okay? Because people use simple heuristics. Who are the experts? Who do I trust? And bringing on somebody who really isn't that qualified, another kind of physician who happens to share my politics to spread another message, I find that kind of dangerous. The second problem we have is, say we even, I can't think about all this information. Really, what do I know? I'm a PhD, and I was a biology major for a while. And yet I don't know all of this information that's coming in about COVID, and I read about it every day. But so what I do is I use simple heuristics. I'll trust the experts. But what if I want to pay careful attention? What if I'm like Joe Alcock and I really am an expert? There's another troubling problem in people's scientific thinking is that there's a study that was done with Stanford undergraduates in which they were presented evidence on both sides, scientific evidence that was conflicting about the death penalty. And after hearing that conflicted evidence, these are smart kids, Stanford undergraduates, the ones who were pro-death penalty walked away thinking they were more in favor of the death penalty. The ones who were anti walked away thinking, yeah, I'm more anti, based on the exact same evidence. So that's an interesting problem. There is one kind of solution to that, which is to get people to try to think, imagine what you would do if the results came out on the other side, but that's a tricky one to do. The third obstacle that we get, so say, I have paid attention to the issue and I have tried to think carefully about it. Another set of obstacles comes from these fundamental social motives. We're designed to try to, as I said before, protect ourselves from the bad guys, protect our children, find mates. And when you activate one of these motives, it really does change the way we think. So for example, just activating fear causes people to become rigid. And I think that some of what's been happening here is that on both sides, people do become kind of rigid. I mean, you see people, there's this discussion that the U.S. has never been more polarized. I don't know that that's really true, because I lived through the Vietnam era and it was pretty polarized then. But nevertheless, people are thinking in rigid ways right now. And a second kind of a fundamental motive that's really important is affiliation. So look, I want to be accepted by my friends. So, and Athena, you know this, when it comes to things like evolution, for the average person, for Athena and I, Joe Alcock, evolution matters, okay? But for the average person out on the street, what do I care what the biologists think about where we came from? I want my friends to like me. And so if my minister says evolution's wrong, that's fine, And so that's an interesting problem, because I think now that social motivation, you guys keep referring to the red-blue team, that's incredibly highly activated now. And, I almost feel like I had a plumber come into my house the other day, and I sort of worried that he was a member of the other team. And I didn't even ask him to wear a mask because I thought he'd probably get pissed at me. So that's an interesting kind of a problem right now. How do you overcome some of these social obstacles? Well, one of them is to bring in people from the other side. If there is actually scientific, misconceptions going on, if you can bring people from the other side, when you can get the Pope to say he accepts evolution, that's a good thing. I really like listening to Keith, because Keith talks with that sort of military sound, using military sounding terminology, and he's been in the military. And when he talks about this argument, hey, I'm in the military, if we're going to blow something up, I wear ear protection, if I'm going to see a bright light, I wear, eye protection. I think that kind of way of framing it would be incredibly useful. for people to think about. And another analogy I heard the other day, which I thought was really great, is, people are talking about this in terms of freedom. Look, we're certainly willing to give up our freedoms. Nobody says, hey, I want my freedom. I'm going to drive down a busy street in New York City with my headlamps off at 2:00 in the morning. Okay. And nobody's trying to argue for that. So I think that the framing issue, it's a useful thing to begin thinking about.
That makes a lot of sense, Doug. I wanted to jump in with one more question or issue around these fundamental motives, because one thing that I've heard from some of my friends who are sort of more on the realm of kind of being willing to go out there and take risks are, people who are single, or, they don't have a partner, they don't have a family, they don't kind of have a that focus. The trade-offs are much more visceral for them of, not being out there. What are your thoughts in terms of how this ties in with the sort of fundamental motives issues?
Yeah, I mean, so Dave and I are writing a book right now on fundamental motives and kind of applying them to everyday life. And one of the conversations we have is that the fact of the matter is there are trade-offs all the way up and down the line. And so, I don't think we can just say, hey, there's one correct decision for, a particular person, because they do have to decide, do you want to go a year of your college life without finding a mate? Maybe you don't. Okay. And then the question of, how guilty are you going to feel if you get COVID and your grandpa gets it and dies? You probably will, but that's not exactly what when you're actively thinking about mating. We're here because our ancestors managed to find a mate, and there were a lot of obstacles to that. And sometimes they endangered themselves and others when they were going after mates. And so that is an interesting problem. I don't have a really good answer to that, but
sometimes they endanger their mate.
Yeah. If you had to keep your grandpa alive to have a baby, then we would have very different evolutionary motivations.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And going back to sort of Jonny's comments there related to that, I don't know that we were actually in so much disagreement. There's a phrase we use when there's red teams and blue teams, not in politics, but just in terms of gaming. And there's those folks that are purple. Purple means you have a pluralistic role and a pluralistic outlook, and that's especially important, when you're looking at multiple objectives, maybe from multiple teams or forces. And I think the real danger now is that the sort of dichotomous thinking that we're being forced into or trapped into, not only just by this pandemic, but by other social forces and things that are happening, is really where the threat is. And the thing to do, I think, is to try to encourage more pluralistic, third way thinking, if you will, or more purple thinking rather than red team, blue team thinking, so that we can actually not feel like I'm single, I don't have family, but look around in our communities and our neighbors and say, these are my family.
I agree with that. Can I actually make a quick point tying this together? So Keith and Doug both discussed political polarization. I guess we all have. And I had mentioned before that there's actually a connection between the problems of institutional responses being effective and trust in experts. And that is, when expertise becomes politicized, obviously people trust the experts less. And I wanted to mention a paper called Fear and Loathing Across Party Lines, which came out a few years ago. And that paper found that political polarization and distrust across party lines, political bias, is actually stronger than racial bias, gender bias, or any other form of bias in the United States. So it's gotten worse, not better. And then there's obvious motivated reasoning associated with that. So I couldn't agree more with what Keith just said.
Great. So we're kind of getting to our last few minutes, but I want to offer an opportunity for any sort of closing words from our guests, or Dave, also, if you want to jump in with anything.
Actually, you know what? I'm going to jump in with a comment from Joe Alcock, which I really like, which is, he says he has an easy time getting people to wear masks. I just tell them I'm super high risk since I see COVID patients every day. And I think this is like, in terms of, because one of my problems is always, I don't want it to be like, hey, you should put on a mask to protect me if I see someone with a mask. But if I say, hey, you might, like, so sort of, I think often when we do the podcast, we often end with sort of ways we can solve this problem. And I think that this is a really interesting sort of solution in a sort of interpersonal thing of frame it in terms of, hey, could you put this on to protect yourself rather than to protect me? And so I was just curious if you guys had any other suggestions for how we could solve this problem and get people to wear more masks.
Well, I could share a sort of
get people like you, Dave, to wear more masks. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. Sure. Get people like me to wear more masks. So
I think Diana's right that guilt and shame are underused emotions. We just need to harness them in the right ways. If we overuse them, then of course people tune out. But if we use
Sorry. I don't think the guilt and shame, I think guilt and shame would have already worked, and they don't tend to work. And I was talking about how this study that they did where somebody said, how guilty would you feel if you gave someone a flu that killed them versus chlamydia that won't kill them, right? So the behavior is really highly tied in. Also from working with people in the developing world on hand washing, people literally accidentally, they give their toddlers diarrheal diseases that kill them because they don't wash their hands. And it's very difficult to moralize washing your hands. So in some of these countries, Muslims who wash their hands as a way of purifying themselves to pray, they have much better outcomes because they wash their hands not for any kind of hygiene reason. And so it would go ahead. What?
Are you saying, like, even if you connect those and you say, if you fail to wash your hands, you're much more likely to kill grandma, people don't listen to that?
I just don't think that people germ theory is so abstract. So when it comes to something like putting on a seatbelt, that's something that people have like a habit to do now. People don't think I'm going to put on my seatbelt so I don't die. They just put on their seatbelts. And in terms of washing their hands, I mean, I worked on hand washing for a long time. A large percentage of the population do not wash their hands. And
Diana, can I throw in something here? We're talking about guilt and shame, and I actually think that in some sense the red-blue thing is getting amplified by this notion that it's a shaming issue. There's a really fascinating study that Bob Cialdini, who's our co-author on the social psych book, one of his colleagues, and I'm forgetting his name, but he's done some research showing that the best way to get people to do something is just ask them to do it. And he said it's, we always talk about you have to use all these techniques, these tricks and so forth. And he said, you go out in public. There's one classic study that was done at the University of Pennsylvania where people walked out on the street and said, hey, would you mind doing 10 push-ups? And they compared it to a condition in which they said, I'm doing a psychology experiment. Would you mind doing 10 push-ups? When they said it's a psychology experiment, people said, well, why should I do them? When they didn't say that, people just got down and said, where? Here? And they did the push-ups. And so it's amazing. So like one of the things that I've noticed is that when I go to a store and there's a sign on the door, it may annoy that small teeny fraction, 1/100th of 1% of, lunatic who's going to shoot the poor guy at the clerk in the store. But for most average people, it's just like, it's a reminder to me to go back to my damn car and get the mask. And I think just asking, I think if I had asked, when I go for my golf lesson, and I think the guy who teaches me, he looks like a typical my age white guy from Florida, buff. He might have voted for, someone other than who I voted for. But, he asked me, hey, I'll wear a mask if you want me to. And what I didn't say is, yes, I want you to. So I think that if we simply, asking is incredibly powerful and a sort of a simple reminder, just a polite reminder without the shame, might be better. Just get more of those reminders out there.
Putting on my kind of skeptic hat for a minute, right here in New Mexico, there's a mandate. Everybody has to wear masks everywhere in grocery stores and shops. You don't see people even, most people on the street are wearing them. And yet we're still having a massive surge. So you can encourage people to wear masks in public, but it doesn't actually seem that might be where the bulk of transmission is happening. And maybe Dr. Zed has got something he wants to say in the comments about that. But it's the whole thing is even more compounded by the idea that we actually don't know what we're doing and we don't know how to control people's behavior very well. We don't know how to change it. If you ask simply without any political affiliation, maybe people are willing to do that. But there
is evidence that shows that you described the guy before who was a hairdresser who didn't pass on COVID. Yeah. It was because he was wearing a mask. So, the evidence is that it doesn't solve everything. But, it's just keeping away from people and wearing masks. You can't transmit viruses that are airborne if you're standing away from people and you both have masks on, and so sure, there's lots of other things going. People aren't wearing the masks, even in New Mexico, even liberal people like Dave and me. We don't wear our mask all the damn time. And that's the problem. It's not that the mask doesn't, if we really wore masks and we really stood 6 feet apart, it'd be pretty damn hard to get that virus over to the other person.
Keith, did you have anything you want to say in closing?
Well, I like this idea of simple asking, and I appreciate the notion of cognitive dissonance. And I can remember a situation where I was on pass, actually needing to get back to campus and grab some stuff because I knew we were going to be closed down. And I had changed from my uniform into my whatever civilian attire I had, which included my Cornell sweatshirt. And I was pumping gas outside of Albany, New York, and was wearing my mask, of course, and had my military uniform hanging in the back window of the vehicle. And a guy pulled up next to me who clearly was proud of not wearing a mask, and he kind of shouted over to me, "Living in fear, are you?" And I said, well, just doing my duty as a patriot. And he said, "Why are you wearing a mask?" And I said,
passive aggressive.
"Well, it's just one more effort that I have where I'm trying not to kill you." And I said, have a look at the uniform hanging there in the back of my car. And he looked over there, and I said, "Guess where I've been?" And he reached for his mask on the dashboard, and I kind of drove away after that, chuckling. So I think the cognitive dissonance make people think about it from a different perspective than the tailgate, and you never know what might happen.
Thanks, Keith. I think that was a great way to close. And thank you, Diana, Doug, Jonny, for being with us today for this first episode of The Other Side. I have to say that for me, it was really great hearing from and making new friends on the other side as well. So thank you all.
I know it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Zed, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from studio.
And if the